Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, July 27th. Just a minute or two behind our regular schedule. Camp schedule ending for the summer pretty shortly. We're not having camp during August. It'll be up to me to keep the kids active and engaged. So that ain't happening. Oh, man. We got a month coming up. But anyway, I think we'll be able to start the show on time after this week. Except, of course, for that week during which I will be practicing international diplomacy, touring Niagara Falls. Does that count as barely international? But country is a country. We must respect the sovereignty of Canada, I think. Unless, of course, Donald Trump gets elected, in which case, woo, we're just going to pee all over and write USA and urine all over Canada and pretty much the rest of the world. Because, I don't know, America, strength, because we can. And if you can't stop us, then to hell with it, we're going to do it. That's right. Donald Trump is set to take a dump on the rest of the world in the name of the United States of America. And we're possibly about to let him do that. Okay, let's not. Let's get together and stop the guy. Wouldn't that be nice? Anyway, we have a convention going on the Democratic side discussing the terms under which we will actually do something like that. It takes planning to stop an apocalypse, I guess. And now's the time to do it. Thanks to Bill in Portland, Maine, for starting us off with the morning tweet, as he always does. Today, we remember to read it. Daily Coast Radio is live now. Kagro X, that's me, David Waldman, hacks into Russia's party database and replaces Putin with Pikachu. It's like Letterman has come to the rescue, although that's an awful lot of letters. Is there anything we can change Putin to with just one? I don't know. We'll have to give that some thought. Anyway, it is day 3 now of the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's a lot of syllables. Day 2 is wrapped. We can talk a little bit about that. I don't know whether Armando is free to discuss things today. I don't believe he was in Philadelphia yesterday, just Monday, making the visit. I don't think I'm going to get a chance to get up there at all. And who am I kidding? There's no way I'm going to do that. Would have been nice to stop in and, hey, say hello to everybody who's running for president and other offices. But good luck to you nonetheless. I assure you, I'm on your side. How's that? That sounded pretty rousing. It's all about, riling up the troops at this point. A little more protest activity yesterday in the sense that there was additional protest activity. I think less in terms of how much and for how long and how sustained and how many people were involved in the protest activity. By all measures, it still seems that we're still talking about 90% or so of Bernie Sanders supporters realizing, the next thing that we really have to work on is making sure that Donald Trump doesn't win. And the most effective way of doing that is going to be voting for Hillary Clinton. Some holding their noses, I guess. Others not so much. That's what this convention is all about. If you happen to be on the ground or watching it, the idea is to get you a little happier and more excited about doing the work ahead of us. Seems to be working for most. There was a bit of let's see. There were some Bernie delegates walked out. Some. And it wasn't a small number, but it wasn't nearly the majority or even close. I think we're talking about 200 or so out of the 1,800 or so Bernie Sanders delegates who were involved in this, but they walked out after the vote. They stuck around to cast their votes, which I guess is the minimum we can expect from them as delegates and new recruits to political life in some cases, many of them, not all. They walked out and they marched over to the press tent, whereupon they attempted to get into the press. I don't know what they were thinking about doing in the press tent. I guess they were going to go in there and tell the press something. But for the most part, they were blocked out of there by police, and then police prevented the press from leaving. And so the two looked at each other through panes of, plastic, meant to be panes of glass. So they stared at each other through the windows. And it was very interesting. I guess with Twitter, they finally figured out what was going on. But there were some reporters, it seemed, via Twitter, who were confused as to the nature of the protest, and were saying rather snarkily, protesters, these days you can protest via Twitter from the comfort of your own smartphone. There's no need to come in here and barricade us in our press tent. But that really evidenced no actual understanding of the purpose of the protest, but I don't know if anybody understood the purpose of the protest. Also interesting, of course, were photographs of the protesters holding "No Justice, No Peace" signs with tape over their mouths because, of course, they felt they had been silenced by the Democratic National Committee. And it said so right on the tape over their mouths. That was an interesting combination, though. No justice, no peace, and tape over your mouth. Are you sure I'm not going to get any peace unless there's some justice? Because right now it's pretty quiet. It was a silent protest, apparently. And I don't know if no justice, no peace works as a sign there. I mean, it was hard enough to get the over the I guess the appropriation of the no justice, no peace line by a fairly white crowd. But justice is for everyone, and it's okay. And I think you can borrow that line without saying it was culturally appropriated necessarily. But the peace part, well, okay. I mean, we aren't at peace, but it sure is quiet. Anyway. There's protest at every convention, certainly every Democratic convention. At Republican conventions, sometimes they crack down on it a little harder. Not so much the case this time. But the focus was inside the hall because television. And, of course, another round of terrific speeches yesterday. What did you think of the Bill Clinton speech? We'll be asking you that. We'll be maybe talking to Armando about that one. Joan, of course, off for this week on vacation, as is Greg Dworkin. So for now, all I can promise you is my own reaction, and I guess a roundup of what's circulating outside of my kitchen as well. Because why not? We'll talk to a few other people, perhaps, through their writing about what they thought about it. Interesting in that it was a different kind of speech, right? He was there as political spouse rather than as former president. Of course, he's both, so there was a little bit of a mix. But as it should have been, it was largely biographical speech about Hillary. And, of course, anyone who observed the spousal speeches at both conventions, well, there's no comparison, of course, because Melania, she may know nothing at all about Donald Trump. She may know nothing at all about his early life, and she may know nothing at all about their current time together. It wasn't evidenced in the speech. Of course, she was working with she's got a bit of a handicap in that she's got a very heavily accented voice, and it doesn't seem super comfortable for her to be speaking at great length and with rhetorical flourish with that accented English. I don't know whether she is uncomfortable with it because she thinks that Republican delegates don't like hearing accented voices, or maybe it's just simply difficult for her. She may not give a damn one way or the other, which I think would be the best thing for her personally. But anyway, she didn't have much to say about Donald Trump except, gosh, he's wonderful. He's just the bestest, husband and father. Boy, is he, super dedicated to whatever the hell it is he does. And also us, by the way, P.S. And I saw noted by some of the commentators last night, even when his children were speaking, they mostly gave testimonials regarding his mentorship of their business ventures, as opposed to, gosh, he was a great dad, and boy, it was so important to me that he came to my basketball games or whatever. I don't know if those guys I don't know if they played any sports or whatever. And they were mostly raised by mom anyway. I mean, Donald has been pretty open in his, disdain for actual child rearing duties. So, and that was like actually a point that Melania was willing to make in public, if not in the speech. She's made it in public before that, we're traditionalists in the sense that I do the mothering of our son Barron, and I don't want Donald involved in, diapering and putting kids to bed, and neither does he want to be involved. Gee whiz, that's just super great, and if you're over 100 years old, you probably thought that was awesome. Anyway, of course, by contrast, Bill knew Hillary's history inside and out and was able to relate that to people. I guess it's possible that for the first time, there are people who are learning for the first time what her activist history really is. And it's a message that always bears repeating, even to the audiences who know it very well. There's always somebody who doesn't, and certainly a lot of people felt like they got to know her a little bit better, came in some measure to understand a very complicated, to say the least, marriage between these two. It's not like yours or mine. They're different people. They do things differently. They deal with different problems. Only complaint of any kind that I saw among the punditry about it, his discussion, was that, I don't know, some people actually felt like, well, maybe you needed an even more obvious nod to their marital difficulties and the Monica Lewinsky episode. Although, better point, I thought, was made when someone observed, I was watching CNN for much of the post-speech discussion. I don't know why. It was the only one that was going on long enough to keep me distracted while I was finishing up for the night and getting things put away and getting ready to go to sleep, I guess. And they certainly helped me with that. But the better point, I think, if I'm Hillary Clinton, and it is her night, if I'm Hillary Clinton, maybe I don't want my husband lingering on that. For a number of reasons, including I'm running for president, and I'd really like not rather dwell on that very much. Thanks very much. Anyway, it went, I thought, very well. More to come. And, of course, I guess the Republican critics pointing out once again, still nobody's talking about ISIS. They're stunned that on the Democratic side there's more to talk about than crapping your pants because ISIS. Well, I guess if the plan is being followed, we should hear some about that tonight. In case you've been missing being scared to death about terrorism, we'll do it our way later on this evening. Okay, we'll get to more of that roundup. I guess the other thing that seems to be burning up the internet, there were, of course, plenty of conservatives blathering and looking to take attention away, I guess, from the Democratic convention, although they were just basically doing what they always do. And tops of the list there, Bill O'Reilly, not a particularly relevant guy, but there he is, making himself a spectacle. I guess this is amazing. It's amazing that this even happened. Michelle Obama, in her great speech, noted, really, not in passing, but it wasn't. Well, it was a big theme of what was going on in the speech. But here's the thing: it isn't something that needed to be fact checked. Though if you did fact check it, the facts are duh. There it is. She's correct. Was the White House built by slaves? She made the point. The White House built by slaves. Now my daughters are playing with their dogs on the lawn. We're living there. That's testimonial to some damn thing or another. I mean, come on. But no, they can't even let her have that point. I don't really know why. I mean, are they personally embarrassed by slaveholding a couple centuries ago? I mean, it's an embarrassing fact about the country. But I don't know. I guess I really thought we had come to terms with the fact that there were slaves and that it sucked to be one. But no. So Michelle makes mention of this, and I guess the conservative pastime for the rest of the day yesterday, afterwards, after the speech, was somehow this had to be proven wrong. I don't know why they didn't focus on, were they really playing with the dog? They were there with the dog, but isn't it really true? I don't know. They could have focused on that. They could have focused on any number of things, but they decided maybe the White House wasn't really built by slaves, or, facing the truth on that one. Well, every historian says yes. Here are the records of it. Well, maybe it was that they didn't treat those particular slaves all that badly. In other words, actually, some slaves had it good, and it was really better for everybody to keep people in slavery. I mean, then somebody was making the claim, I don't know who or whether it has any grounding in it, but, somebody said some of the slaves were paid, and of course that may actually have been true in the sense that somebody got, paid for their labor. It just often, usually, almost always, wasn't them. A lot of slaves were skilled laborers, having been taught forcibly to acquire these skills, and it was better than being a field hand, yes, but the idea generally was a slave owner would train their slaves in skilled labor and then place them in jobs where that skilled labor was needed, and then charge the person who was constructing the building or doing whatever the skilled labor involved money for essentially rental of the slave's skill set, and then the slave owner takes the money. And somebody was making the claim that there was this one slave, you see, who was paid directly, and he got to keep the money. And then, of course, he put it in his hedge fund and leveraged it into a $1 billion international corporation and bought the freedom of all of his family and friends. That obviously didn't happen. Even so, even if there was one guy, and really, one guy got to keep the money. So really, was this whole civil war necessary? Apparently. And yet, they cling to this, and nobody knows whether it's true or not. I haven't seen anybody come up with records. There was this one slave whose name was whatever the hell his master said his name was, apparently. He got to keep the money. Okay, now, if that were true, of course, you'd be talking about a guy who got to keep the fruit of his labors because his owner said, yeah, that's okay with me. Because he had to say that. Because he's his owner. Because he's a slave. It really kind of sucked. Even if you got paid, it really didn't matter. The basic situation was, well, congratulations. Here's a day's pay for your day's labor. Now, be back on my property by sundown or I'll hang you. Okay, see you at work tomorrow. We're just co-workers. How's your cubicle looking these days, buddy? Between that and Bill O'Reilly, who got himself on, he's always on TV, but got himself written up because his claim was slaves who built the White House were well fed and had decent lodgings provided by the government, which ordinarily, now if I tried to offer conservatives who like Bill O'Reilly good food and decent lodgings provided by the government, what would they say that was, besides tyranny? They would describe their condition as, I reject this because I'm not a slave. I reject government slavery. Even though it's got some sweet lodgings, I still feel like I would like to, I was thinking about traveling to New York with my hard-earned wages. Can I do that? Well, I would recommend against that because that would mean you were a fugitive and I'd have to hang you, probably just on any tree alongside the road. Well, freedom. I just would rather sleep in this shed then, I guess. Maybe that's a good idea. Free chains, though. That's cool. Thanks very much, Master. Appreciate that. And Yeah, I guess it just doesn't strike some people that the slave's condition is a problem because you're owned. Now, there's plenty of other things that they heaped on top of it. Like, again, boy, you really are a skilled laborer. That's fantastic. Thank you. I'm earning so much money from your labor. In fact, why don't you keep a little bit? By the way, just as a thing, I just wanted to remind you, 4 o'clock, I'm whipping you. If that's good. If 4 is good, if it's no good for you, I can push that to 5, but you are getting whipped. Why? Why not? I mean, I have to remind you who's boss here, right? So that's what it comes down to. He got good food and decent lodging, and as I tweeted last night, I'm selling your children, but you really are a fantastic worker. I appreciate what you do for our organization. You're a very valuable player, and not to mention, not only are you making money for us with your skills, but selling your children has been pretty lucrative. By the way, half of them are also my children, but what the hell do I care? Breeding is very profitable as well. I'll sell all I want. You'll make more, basically, is the condition. But that's okay with Bill O'Reilly because of the sweet lodgings and pretty good food from the government. I mean, you try giving people help paying for their health insurance. They insist that's slavery. Now they're trying to they're trying to, like, I don't know what, free person explain slavery to everybody else. Yes, right, as Justice puts it here, the auction block, that's just team building, if you think about it. So you stand up there, we'll talk about money, and then you fall back and your new owner will catch you. It's a trust exercise. It's going to be really great. Anyway, people, real living human beings, do say these things, and they're on television. Memo to Fox News. It's not Roger Ailes anymore who's in charge of this stuff, I guess. But I guess, I mean, with O'Reilly satisfied that sweet lodgings and pretty good food makes up for or excuses slavery, I think you've been overpaying this man. It sounds like he would be doing the job for a lot less. Maybe a little food from the commissary and permission to sleep on a couch, and you got yourself a show. But, I don't know, maybe that's just good for those people. For me, I gotta be rich. Anyway, wow. There's a lot going on in the world. And, we'll catch up with some of it. Other things developing, of course, from, our view of how the media is digesting the events of this week and the week past. We definitely have to catch up on the Donald Trump side of things. I mean, he's sort of irrelevant to this week, but I have a feeling that at some point we'll have to address the burgeoning Russia story with what passes for fact and some of the best conjecture, I guess. Yesterday, Donald Trump injected himself back into the conversation by tweeting, sort of at random. I don't know what he was tweeting in response to directly, but clearly the Russia story is beginning to bug him. And he tweeted out, for the record, which I thought was a funny thing to say for a guy who won't show us the record. For the record, I have zero, he said, investments in Russia. Which is an interesting sidestep all by itself, of course, as many people were pointing out. The issue isn't really so much whether you have investments in Russia, but rather whether Russia has investments in you. In Soviet Union... what? I don't know. Something. Invest in you. You see that the construction was partially there. You can't fault me entirely for trying to hammer that peg into that hole. But yeah, that's the real issue is, are Russians funding you? Are they, I mean, somebody put it out there today in the right terms. I am not certain that we have hammered out the facts at this point, but we've got this headline, which I think is the right kind of conjecture. From the Daily News Bin, which I'm not even sure what kind of publication that is. Are we talking about a blog? Or are we talking about I don't know what, a private newsletter of some kind? This is not, I'm not even clear on what this is. But anyway, I like the headline. Deeply in debt to Russians, Donald Trump may only be running for president to avoid bankruptcy. I think that sews up what the suspicions are, though this wouldn't be where I would go for the hard evidence to show that it was true. Let me just kind of skim and see what they have to say about this by way of setup. In the days following the revelation that the Russians may have hacked the Democratic Party email servers in order to try to sabotage the United States presidential election in favor of Donald Trump, bad enough, and his own son's admission that he's increasingly in debt to the Russians, that came up again the other day, it's raised the question of whether Trump is anything more than a political and financial patsy of Vladimir Putin. Clearly, this isn't the New York Times writing this one, but it raises the same question. They just don't like to say it that way. It also raises the deeper question of whether Trump, whose debt load has exploded over the past year, may only be running for president in order to prevent his shaky empire from collapsing into bankruptcy, which normally hasn't disturbed him a great deal in the past, but it certainly would be, well, you want to avoid it if you can. And if you're running for president on your business prowess, you don't want like a fifth one. It's already been well documented that American banks are no longer willing to loan money to Donald Trump due to the pattern he's displayed, that is his pattern of strategically not paying his bills or repaying his debts when he thinks he can get away with it, as with the USA Freedom Kids. That was some story yesterday. And yet, he's managed to nearly double his debt load over the past year by borrowing a flurry of funds from overseas investors. Very often, when you can't get money loaned to you from traditional sources, you go to untraditional sources, and sometimes that's mobsters on the street, and they will give you the cash, but under extraordinarily unfavorable terms. Russia has a mafia, sort of different, but, you know, it's out there. Anyway, despite the debt load and despite the fact that traditional banks won't lend to him, someone is lending to him. Why are these foreign bankers and others willing to make the risky move of loaning money to Trump if they know there's a strong chance it won't be paid back? The short answer is they might be gambling that they're buying influence over the United States government if Trump is elected president. Or they might be buying influence over the United States government because they're afraid they will pull the plug and or break his legs. I don't know. That in turn calls into question why Donald Trump chose now to enter politics after spending decades threatening to do so. Throughout the general election, he's proven consistently unwilling, this is sort of a different take, consistently unwilling to take the steps needed to broaden his appeal enough to compete for undecided voters in the general election, and instead seems to be merely going through the motions of remaining in the race until the end. Between now and November, he should be able to borrow even more money from foreign investors who are taking the sucker's bet that he might become the next president and be able to pay them back with governmental favors instead of loan repayments. Throw in the fact that Donald Trump continues to refuse to release his tax returns to the public even after it's caused him months of grief and distrust among voters, and it raises the question of just what he's hiding. Is he far more in debt than we know? Has he been taking out these loans from foreign investors simply to cover his existing deep debt and avoid yet another bankruptcy? Did he enter the race last year simply because he knew that it would make it easier for him to secure loans from foreigners? Even if Donald Trump loses this election, he'll have managed to milk his status as a Republican nominee to the tunes of hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in overseas loans, and there will be little that these foreign investors can do to get their money back from him in the end, until he is willing to release his tax returns and allow the American public to see what financial secrets he's been hiding, just how deeply in debt he is, and how much of it he owes to the Russians, among other hostile nations. It's fair to ask if his entire campaign has been one desperate long con aimed at keeping himself out of yet another bankruptcy. I don't know. We will, and I'm not 100% certain that his taxes will reveal all either. The taxes we need to see, well, certainly taxes from his personal income, but all the businesses as well. You know, he commingles funds all the time. And I suspect that an awful lot of the money that he's existing on, that he's floating on, comes through the businesses instead. And I'm sure that the Russians, for the most part, would prefer to launder their money that way. In other words, he develops a residential condo tower with multi-million-dollar penthouses in it, and he sells those to Russian oligarchs or, whoever. I guess before this time period, it had historically been Saudi princes, but it's certainly something you could sell instead to to Russian oligarchs, to Chinese oligarchs for that matter, and simply launder the money that way. It all comes into Trump Tower, and Trump Tower pays a management fees to Trump himself, and it's cash in his pocket. And it works better that way. And so his taxes, therefore, would show management fees from Trump Tower. That's clean money as far as, standing by itself, the tax returns doesn't tell us anything. I doubt very much whether his taxes say, things like item 1, payment from Russian mobster, $1 million. Item 2, payment from Chinese mobster. It's not going to say that. But we're going to need to see instead, what kind of ownership interest is there in any one of his businesses, either straight up purchase of condos or office space or whatever it is that he's selling in his real estate schemes, or I guess even harder to trace would be, a Russian mobster using a shell corporation, perhaps headquartered offshore somewhere. So a Grand Cayman Islands based corporation, which just happens to be stuffed to the rafters with Russian mobster money, is an equity partner in one of the many other projects he launches, whether it's something real-ish like Trump Tower or whether it's something fake-ish like Trump Steaks or Trump Baja or whatever, Trump Vodka. I mean, what do you do when fake name LLC, Grand Cayman Islands Incorporated organization, puts $10 million into Trump Baja Acquisitions LLC, and then the whole thing goes bust, and his personal taxes show some kind of licensing agreement payment from the partners in Trump Baja, but looked at this way, all you really have is, here is a company that seems shady because it's headquartered in Grand Cayman Islands and no one's ever heard of it, but it has $10 million to drop on a real estate venture that, hey, gee whiz, it just didn't work out and it doesn't come through, but it went into the bank account of this operation, which parked it for a few days and then converted some or all or most of that money into management/licensing fees to Trump, ostensibly for lending his name to the operation. And you're allowed to do that, and what do we do with it? So I'm not even certain that the taxes reveal it. I think you would need a much deeper, more thoroughgoing forensic audit to figure it out. But you're not going to get something like that until the guy's on trial for whatever it is you're able to charge him with in pursuit of these allegations. And that's not happening anytime soon. And by the way, it's also, and not only are you unlikely to be able to prove it with just the taxes, but, just food for thought. How far do you get in unraveling this if the guy were to win? If the guy was also able to, wrongly, I think, claim executive privilege over almost everything he's done or ever did, even though there's pretty strong precedent that more than suggests, but absolutely establishes without a shadow of a doubt, that executive privilege cannot be applied to activities undertaken before assuming the presidency, that will result in litigation nonetheless, not only from the Trump side, simply disputing that as a matter of settled law, but in addition just saying, it's so disruptive to me and my awesome brain in the presidency, I cannot be bothered by this. You're not allowed to discuss this with me during the term of my presidency. It didn't work very well for Bill Clinton, but gee whiz, I don't think that they really care, and it would be ironic, I guess, that they were trying to invoke the same arguments, even though they were pretty sure it was BS when Clinton was invoking it, but that wouldn't stop a gimme-tarian like Trump. Anyway, it's not really likely to come to fruition. And I see Armando making the point, and I don't really know how we fix it, but, he makes the correct point. Trump repeatedly said he would release his tax returns. Now he says he will not. Media yawns. Nice work, guys. I really don't know what they're likely to do about it. I mean, I can't see the media simply saying, well, I'll show you. We won't report on what you're saying. That ain't going to work as a business model. They could, of course, keep reporting that he hasn't released his tax returns, and so therefore that makes him something less than a legitimate candidate. But I don't know if that bothers his supporters enough for them to think about whether or not it's worth casting their vote for him. I don't think they care what he does. So I don't know. It seems pretty amazing. It's quite the conundrum, if you will. All right. Well, so I think that piece sort of sets the scene for what could possibly be wrong with the whole Trump connection with Russians in general. This was an interesting thing, too, just, I guess, in terms of the tax returns. And Armando answers, what the media should do is report every day that he hasn't released his tax returns and that there are big questions on why. Yeah. Although I guess we're finally getting to see that now that there's a super sexy Russian connection being supposed. But I don't think still don't think anybody on the Trump side of the ledger would be phased in the least. But again, thankfully that's still a significant minority, and I suppose it does do something to prevent your casual possible Trump voter from straying over the line and claiming that they had no idea. But I don't know. I mean, I do feel like I have been seeing reports on it each day, but it certainly hasn't sunk in to the consciousness to the level that, for instance, we very often see among major media figures when they're asked for their commentary on something that Hillary Clinton is doing. They're very at ease with offhandedly commenting, well, she has trust issues with people, and people just really don't feel like they don't know and trust Hillary Clinton, and they feel like she's an overachiever and kind of a screechy lady or whatever. And they feel perfectly comfortable saying things like this. And they haven't gotten to the point. I guess this is true. Even though everybody does feel this, and this is another interesting sort of thing. You don't hear major pundits on the CNN post-speech roundup say casually, as though it were assumed that everybody had this in the back of their mind. They don't say things like, well, Donald Trump really has this issue with people where most people think he's a slimy, underhanded schemer. Sometimes that goes without saying with the kind of businesses that he's in, but he's really a cartoonishly underhanded, money-grubbing fame whore, and everybody knows it. And they haven't gotten comfortable with saying that, and I'm not really sure why. Maybe they're afraid of being sued. I mean, he does do that, but I don't think that anybody's going to be paying that out of pocket. Anyway, they work for major media organizations. And Armando reminds us, Mark Halperin, though he's no yardstick for anything, said Dems make too much out of it, and the opposite of what they should be doing is what they're avoiding it. Okay, well, I agree, certainly. I'd love to see more discussion of it, and I'd love to see some sort of parity, at least, if not tilting the playing field entirely, as I think is justifiable. But if you're going to comment with relative ease about Hillary Clinton, well, everybody knows XYZ about her, or you know how I'm not saying this is true, but I know that there's this feeling out there, and there's the optics, and then, well, you know, what are the optics? How come there's no discussion of the optics? They loved optics up until Donald Trump's optics could have become an issue, and then optics weren't interesting unless Hillary's name was under discussion. I mean, the optics of, think about it, the optics of Donald Trump are ridiculous. I mean, literally ridiculous. A day can't pass where he doesn't the optics of his face are ridiculous. I mean, he's orange. I don't know what else to say. I mean, I know that's substanceless, but that's where they're living, right? The optics of a guy who wears spray tans that literally make his face unnatural colors all the time. And we have the makeup technology to deal with this. He just doesn't do it. He thinks this is normal. Those raccoon eyes painted in orange and red. He pouts and makes the weird pursed lip, pouty looking. I don't know whether he thinks he's being sultry, resolute. I'm not sure what the visual is supposed to be, but you know, if you love optics, well, come on. Here's optics for you. He looks bizarre all the time. Plus, he's garish, he's boorish, he's vulgar, he's empty-headed, he's stubborn as a mule, and he's in his ignorance. And still, we can't say, you know, there's a generalized conclusion that we've all come to about this guy, and here it is. Well, I don't know. Maybe after the election is over, we'll all have that. But, you know, I think he's been a public figure long enough. He's threatened to be a political figure for long enough that this should be established by now. And I don't really know why people are unwilling to say so. So I guess there's my criticism of the media for the time being. I picked this up and put this in pocket. I found this somewhat interesting as a project. I'm not entirely certain I understand every aspect of it, but James Fallows, I guess, has been working on this. The Daily Trump, filling a time capsule. He writes, by way of explanation, and I'll have to read it for the first time myself, people will look back on this era in our history to see what was known about Donald Trump while Americans were deciding whether to choose him as president. Here's a running chronicle from James Fallows on the evidence available to voters as they make their choice, and of how Trump has broken the norms that applied to previous major party candidates. So I found this one first, but it's clearly not the first. It's, in fact, number 57. I should probably just spend the show reading the time capsule, or make room for one or more entries from it each day in order to help bolster the case against Donald Trump. But here's the one I found. Trump time capsule number 57, Russia and taxes. Okay, when something goes wrong, I start with blunder, confusion, and miscalculation as the likely explanations. Planned out wrongdoing is harder to pull off, more likely to backfire, and thus less probable. But it is getting more difficult to dismiss the apparent Russian role in the DNC hack as blunder and confusion rather than plan. And some bullet points on that. Real world, in scare quotes, real world authorities, from the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, to FBI sources, to international security experts, say that the forensic evidence indicates the Russians. No independent authority at all has, no independent authority strongly suggests otherwise. There is an update. The veteran reporters Shane Harris and Nancy Youssef cite evidence that the original hacker was, quote, an agent of the Russian government. So the update isn't, oh, by the way, I was wrong. The update is, oh, by the way, it looks like I'm right. Bullet point. The timing and precision of the leaks on the day before the Democratic convention and on a topic intended to maximize divisions at that convention, and it did do that, is unlikely to be pure coincidence. If it were coincidence, why exactly now? With evidence drawn from hacks over previous months. Why mail only from the DNC, among all the organizations that have doubtless been hacked? And a third bullet point, the foreign country most enthusiastic about Trump's rise appears to be Russia, which would also be the foreign country most benefited by his policy changes, from his sowing doubts about NATO and the EU to his weakening of the RNC platform language about Ukraine. None of this is proof. Remember the difference between evidence and proof? Evidence merely tends to prove that something is true. Proof does it. But all sorts of things can be evidence, including circumstantial evidence, which, by the way, is very often perfectly good evidence and admissible. Don't take your legal training from television. Circumstantial evidence is not preferred when there is harder proof to be had, but it is admissible. None of this is proof, but it is a vivid manifestation of a long-building reality, the chaos that can be unleashed in the new era in which everything is known and anything can be leaked. Concern about these effects goes beyond party. The very conservative defense figure Edward Timberlake wrote about it recently. In Slate, Franklin Foer says, the DNC episode is Watergate, but much worse. Everybody always likes to say, of course, worse than Watergate. I'm waiting for the first, this is at least better than Watergate article about anything. I need to start working on that one. Paul Waldman, no relation, at the Washington Post, writes to similar effect. Thomas Ridd, a security expert at King's College in London, says that because all signs indicate Russian involvement, the U.S. should respond. That's where it begins to make me a little bit nervous, but okay, I gotcha. These new developments underscore the importance of an old and familiar point. Now more than ever, Donald Trump must release his tax returns. Probably would be helpful. To put it differently, the press should no longer normalize his stonewalling on this issue. As another veteran figure in the defense world and political affairs wrote to me this morning, in normal times, this, the Russian hacking, would be the lead on all network news. But these are not normal times. I am having trouble getting through to some people that this is a real thing. The very people who always say follow the money with regard to the Pentagon or other boondoggle bureaucracies don't see that A, Trump has been kept afloat for about 15 years by Russian oligarchs, and B, Russia has a powerful incentive to see a U.S. president who will end economic sanctions. That's very true and a good point, too. And it does come from some very strange corners, I must say. I mean, it wasn't unexpected, but there's... And I would have been surprised if, for instance, the Glenn Greenwald sector didn't cast doubt on this story, because I'd be surprised if Glenn Greenwald didn't cast doubt on any story. That's his chief stock and trade, is he casts doubt on things, which is a trait you want in your journalists, generally speaking. Of course, you don't want that to be the whole game, and you don't want it to be about casting doubt on one type of story and not all, but everybody has their biases to overcome. Me too. I understand, and I'm not willing to write him off. But and he makes it's not an invalid point to say, well, for how long was the United States government or actors often highly placed or seeking to be highly placed in the United States government, for how long did they either cover up their own shenanigans or shortcomings, or generate the fear that was necessary to launch one program or policy objective or another? For how long did they tell you, oh yeah, this or that bad actor is definitely doing this thing, and if I could prove it to you, but if I showed you the evidence, I'd have to kill you. Just take my word for it. It's not that we aren't familiar with that history. So it always pays to cast some doubt. But, on the other hand, since many of them are not averse to casting aspersions to keep their cynicism alive as necessary, I guess it probably ought to be said. Now, I don't come down and clearly in any one camp or the other about, for instance, the issues surrounding Edward Snowden or the personality that is, it's a different entity almost, Edward Snowden. I see the benefit of some of the things that he did, and I see the detriment of some of the things that he did. And I see the negative PR that is generated by fleeing to Russia. And I also see basically, what the hell else are you going to do if you're in his position? I understand it, but I also understand that it doesn't help. It doesn't, help establish necessarily the patriotic bona fides, let's say, of what you've done. And yet I don't dismiss out of hand that some of this was necessary and quite truthfully needed to be disclosed, despite the dangers. I mean, so we live with danger, and that's part of the American experiment, or it's supposed to be. I mean, that's not what Trump would tell you, and Republicans have dedicated the last 20 years of insisting that has no place in the American experiment, but it does. We're supposed to live at some risk. Anyway, I mean, there are certainly people who cast doubt on the very notion that the Russians had anything to do with it, and I guess at some point you might be forced to question, is that because you're giving Russian authorities the benefit of the doubt because you're sympathetic to them because they've sheltered the hero Edward Snowden? I don't know. You hope not, but maybe. I'm just asking questions for which I cannot be imprisoned in this country. Thank you very much, right? Isn't that where you are? I guess if I'm undercutting you, that doesn't... All right, hopefully they'll stand pat on their positions about the freedom of the press, if I'm even the press. Anyway, Donald Trump, James Fallows continues, should, of course, release his tax returns because in modern times that is the basic price of entry in national politics. It has been, but only because everyone has agreed to pay it, really. I would depart from the text here and just say, supposing he just says no. I'm not certain what power the press would agree it has to pull this off. They could do it, I mean, in just the same respect that, well, no one's stopping him physically from not releasing his taxes. No one will stop you physically from saying this is disqualifying and he's a complete nut bar and that's all there is to it. So, I mean, I don't know. But they maintain some professional decorum for some reason. All right. Returning to the article here, along with a plausible rather than Pyongyang Daily News style medical report is long overdue from Trump as well. You remember that crazy looking doctor? Oh, he's the healthiest guy ever in the whole wide world. He should do it whether or not Vladimir Putin ever existed or there was any Russian hack. That would be true in any candidate's case, but especially this one. George Will has come out and said that Trump should release his returns because of questions about his ties to Russian oligarchs. That's great to have George Will, I guess in the back pocket of your non-dungarees. Don't offend the man. But on the other hand, he thinks low pants ruined America, so I'm not certain he's got it all there. With 100 plus days to the election, a nominee about whom there are graver than usual financial questions is saying that, unlike previous candidates, he won't make his finances public. Well, look, I'll say this. I recognize the possibility that the same thing could be done in reverse to someone else, and you could, the term red baiting has come up a lot. And let me just, object to that term because Vladimir Putin's not red. But Donald Trump very nearly is. But, for lack of a better term or an updated term about what it means to find yourselves in thrall to the Russians, I guess red baiting is it. I find it annoying but true that I know, or that you could certainly level unfounded charges very easily against a Democrat, and will rue the day we decided to validate this by going along with it. But fine, I'll rue that day because I very much doubt that we will, in the near future, be in the business of supporting a Democratic candidate who is an American oligarch who has this much to hide and this much, is siphoning this much money out of this many different quote-unquote business angles. But I guess it's possible. And then when that day comes, we'll say, you probably should disclose these things. I don't know. I wonder what else is in the time capsule. Let's see. It does have a button here for show me the newest first. Is the 57 the last one? What's the first one? Here's the oldest first. Oh, look. Here's a whole list of them here. Oh, or at least the last couple of them. Well, I guess the button doesn't really work all that well. Now that I think about it, I hit the oldest and it just brought me back to the same number 57. So that's odd. But let's see, the latest time capsule entries, the last couple of them were up here before. Just going back in time here. Number 56, Russian quids and quos. Number 55, unique threat to democracy and Russian role. So he's been talking about the Russia thing for a couple of days here. Total time spent applauding. You remember that one? Yeah. By the way, that brings me to another point. I forget exactly what it was that brought me into that discussion the other day. But did we talk about the fact that, I think we did. You must have noticed over the weekend that Donald Trump released maybe a web-only ad after the Republican convention, which touted, as we said, the total time during his speech, which was spent on applause. And then it broke it down and just did the math with us. And I spent this much time speaking. There was this much time during which I was interrupted by applause. And that is X percent of my speech. And I don't even really know what that was supposed to prove, but I'm sure in his mind, of course, that meant, look, I'm very popular, and popular people win the presidency, and so you should just give it to me. But it really was one of the more childish things anybody had ever seen from an actual major party nominee. I bring it up, one, because of the ridiculousness of it, but you were already aware of that. But I bring it up also by way of addressing, and maybe this would be a good place to shift briefly, to addressing the divisions at the Democratic convention as between Bernie Sanders holdouts, or Bernie or bust, I guess, holdouts, and everybody else at the convention. And again, we will see this throughout the campaign. There will be people who feel that because they live in what they deem to be safely blue states, and I don't have any real reason to question whether or not they're going to remain safely blue, but people who live there have become used to the luxury of, in many cases, of casting protest votes. That is, everyone knows my state is going to go blue and its electoral votes will land in the Democratic column. And so it won't cost anybody anything for me to cast a protest vote. And likewise, you're seeing in this election, people who live in wherever, in Vermont, I guess, in some cases, even though that's not necessarily the most solid blue place in the whole wide world, but everybody thinks so because Bernie Sanders. But okay, maybe. And New York, others say California, the ones we are traditionally calling as locks for the blue column, and they say, well, then I'll vote for the green candidate, or, back in the day, Ralph Nader, or whoever, or nothing, nobody, or I'll sit on my hands, or I'll vote for whatever, doesn't matter, right? And in normal times, I would say I disagree with the premise, because I think that's leaving the work of preserving our democracy and preserving our policy status quo, or even putting the responsibility for change in other people's hands, and you indulge in the luxury of protesting the whole thing because there isn't anybody perfect out there. But I understand it, and you got to be able to allow for the protest votes. As much as I personally disagree with it, I can't. What are you supposed to do? You can't tell somebody that your vote is important, but that you have to do something you really terribly, deeply disagree with it in order for it to be valid. I can't reconcile those two things, and ultimately I have to say I can't say it's an invalid thing, blanket on its face, to cast a protest vote. I might not do it, but under certain circumstances, I guess I might. If I were a Republican, might I say, well, I can't cast this vote for Donald Trump? Sure. We've been talking all along about the fact that we were counting on there being such people, and we were happy that there were such people. So how do you say that it's not to be allowed on the Democratic side? Well, you can point out, well, we don't actually nominate people that bad. But every once in a while you have to remind yourself, well, okay, I could be biased about that. Or maybe we haven't yet, and maybe I'm absolutely right, but eventually one day we may. I can't say that, with certainty that we never would, and wouldn't I want to be one of those people? So I understand protest votes. I'm rarely tempted to cast one, but then again, I don't live in one of these states, and, it makes a certain amount of sense. You live in a state that's absolutely going to hand over its electoral votes, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But we aren't in a normal election, one, that's true, and I don't necessarily think that changes which states fall in under which colors category. There will be some states that swing for sure, but the ones that are solid blue always and forever will likely remain that way, and so the protest votes will be perfectly safe insofar as the Electoral College is concerned, and insofar as the Electoral College is what gets respected by all the significant players. I don't think that, there's enough distrust of the Electoral College as it is among the liberal ranks. There hasn't been as much concern about it among conservative ranks because they tend to make out considerably better under the Electoral College than they would under other circumstances. Donald Trump, of course, will have, I'm sure, no truck whatsoever with the Electoral College if he loses the election. He's already out there saying this whole thing is rigged again. Anyway, it was rigged, and then he won the primary, and so it wasn't rigged. But now he's at risk of losing the general election, so it's rigged again. So he's investing all his time in letting everybody know that it's rigged, according to him. And, of course, we all expect for him to lose. And so eventually there's going to be a lot of people who have been mainstreamed in their politics, even as they continue their own neo-Nazi politics, who will say, okay, well, we'll give some trust back to the system here, only because I know I have the escape hatch of it's all rigged anyway. And they'll find themselves disappointed by that mysterious Electoral College, even though everyone they know voted for Trump. And, will they all be asked to simply disarm and go home and accept the legitimacy of the process? And who will tell them that? And will they believe that? Of course, we see some not insignificant number of Bernie Sanders supporters disavowing what Sanders himself asks them to do now, and they say, well, that's because he's never been our king and we don't take orders. And similarly, there will be people who say, even if Donald Trump were to acknowledge the legitimacy of the system and ask us all to return peacefully to our homes and come back next time, 4 years from now, there will be people who say, yeah, the hell with that. And those guys are, 1, crazy, 2, armed, and 3, invested in the idea that the existing order needs to be overthrown and is pretty stupid at its core anyway, and this is the reason they've been stockpiling guns all this time anyhow. So I don't know how safe that situation is. But if Donald Trump were to lose, and particularly, I mean, God forbid this should happen in any, well, ever again, really, that someone would win the popular vote, but the electoral vote would go the other way. I don't really want to deal with that conundrum again, but I definitely don't want to deal with that where Donald Trump is involved. I mean, that guy, to the extent that he's got a mind left to lose, would lose it all over again if he were to win the popular vote, which I don't think there's any real reason to worry about, but you never know. I guess it's entirely possible. This kind of election could certainly produce a result like that. If he's overwhelmingly garnering the votes of rural whites, but the concentration of normal people voting blue in the cities is enough to carry certain states and their electoral votes, but in total, the popular vote goes the other way. There's no way he would just simply say, well, we all have to recognize the legitimacy of our system and the legitimacy of electing Hillary Clinton based on this fake, stupid electoral college thing that I love the Constitution, but not this part, put in place way back when and gave us such stupid results as, he'll be perfectly willing to say, as George W. Bush. It won't bother him any to take a shot at him. But there's no chance that he would accept that as a result. And even if it doesn't matter, even if everybody just simply says, well, you're just not relevant, and so therefore we won't listen to you, he'll have people who will listen, and there'll be people out there, and it's bad news to have him be able to point to popular vote results and claim that as legitimacy, even if it means just legitimizing his continued voice as a civilian, even if he never attempts to leverage that into somehow a backdoor into anything, whether the White House or any other kind of power, or just ending the American Republic entirely and taking over as dictator. I don't know. I don't know what he's going to do with it. But what he won't be doing with it is saying, yeah, let's all just accept the results and let bygones be bygones. He'll be pointing at the popular results, and that is, I know that's not going to convince anybody, I don't think, but it's another reason why garbage protest votes, and that's what they are. I understand what you're doing, and it's your vote, and you can do whatever you want with it, but if you're not lining up against Trump in a way that he'll be willing to acknowledge, and who knows what he'd be willing to acknowledge, he'll compare his vote total to Hillary Clinton's vote total, and if it's even close, even if he's losing, he'll be saying that he really won, and he'd be likely to count the votes that go to any protest candidates as well as votes for him, because they're not votes for Hillary Clinton. And boy, won't you be angry if you cast your protest vote for Jill Stein and he gets out there and says, look at all these people who supported change, i.e. electing me. They didn't want Hillary Clinton. More people voted against Hillary Clinton than voted for her, and so therefore I should be president. And if you think you can out-logic, or rather, if you think you can logic Trump supporters out of making that assumption, you haven't been paying attention to what kind of people they are. They're not going to accept your tweets that say, now every vote that wasn't for Hillary Clinton wasn't necessarily a vote in favor of Trump. This was a protest vote. Too late. They will already have done it. And of course, all the people who told you, not necessarily all that correctly, but, with a few leaps in logic themselves, all the people who told you that a vote for Stein is a vote for Trump, they weren't really right, but they will tell you they told you so anyway, and that will be doubly annoying to you. it will be very disturbing to you for both. Imagine that. If you think you're frustrated now, imagine both Donald Trump and Democratic Party loyalists both telling you, "I told you so," and pointing at you as the reason why the next president is destabilized and Donald Trump takes over. You know, that's a lot to lay at your feet. I understand. But it's just something to think about between now and then. That you know that is how he will use the vote totals. It is invalid. It is wrong. But it'll be done and you won't be able to undo it. So with that in mind, and I think that's probably some of what Bernie has in mind, he just, he says it, I say it, it sucks. It's the hard work of democracy. It's swallowing the lesser of two evils, perhaps, yes, but it's actually always better when presented with two evils to select the lesser of the two. It feels good to say I'm not going to fall into that trap, but it's not you that gets to make the call all the time. It shouldn't be him, but it is. And he'll be able to manipulate the meaning of your vote without your consent. I understand this. And I don't want to feed that either. But I also don't want to end the American experiment in a Trump dictatorship, and neither do you. So it's something to think about. It's not definitive, but it's a point on which we can have an ongoing conversation in the coming months. And then we'll see what you do with that. Okay? I just want to put that out there. So back to the Democratic convention angle on protest votes and the various things that might disturb you. We'll leave James Fallows and his time capsule for the moment and instead go over to this story. I still am waiting for some kind of print validation of this story. Perhaps you have seen it. If so, I encourage you to share it with me. But I've got this, I think, that I saw noted by, who is it? It's Jordan Chariton, who is a reporter for the Young Turks, who are they're very enthusiastic Bernie Sanders supporters. More so than I'm willing to admit for myself, I guess. But, those of you who have been with us throughout the primary season and longer know I've got deep sympathies for Bernie Sanders as a candidate, as a politician, for his supporters as people, but I cast my vote the other way. I worked on Bernie Sanders' 2006 Senate campaign. He's where I want him to be. And I'm happy with the outcome. I didn't support him for president. I was sympathetic with any number of the positions that he took and any number of the positions that his supporters took in approaching their support for him, but not for president. But this is this is part of the reason that was, of course, let's see, we got a million different angles to go at this one. But part of the discussion was that really converted me was I just didn't see Bernie filling one of the very important roles of the President of the United States when elected as a Democrat, and that is assuming the mantle of party leader. Consider that, for instance, he's already made the announcement that he'll be returning to the Senate as an independent and not a Democrat. Again, I understood it. I expected it. I respect the motivation behind it. He was elected as an independent and he ought to serve it out that way, and I get it. But there are, of course, plenty of other considerations here, including the optics of dropping by the Democratic Party, seeking to assume the mantle of leading the party, not getting it, and then saying, okay, so I'm kind of done with the party. And yet, of course, his message to his supporters is stay engaged, stay inside the party, try and change it from inside, and that's the message I would want. I agree with him on that one. and yet he's not doing it. But he's got this other compelling interest, which was that he was elected to a fairly important post in our government under a different premise, and he ought to return to it. And okay, I get you. You're working under a different set of circumstances than the rest of the folks here, so fine. Anyway, I just never really saw him taking on the very important mantle of party leader and doing cheerfully, or faking the cheerfulness, some of the most important work, which is in fact party building, and yes, raising money, and yes, big money. You can raise it any way you want in small donations, but there's a lot of money has got to go into this. It's one of the necessary evils of things. And I know that the Bernie supporters say, well, how are we ever going to reverse this trend? How can you dedicate yourself, say, to the reversal of Citizens United while you're out there essentially committing the offenses that Citizens United legalizes? And the answer is, many things in life and politics are contradictory. And if you can understand and appreciate the difficulty of the circumstances, as I hope to be doing in the case of Bernie Sanders' decision to return to the Senate, for instance, as an independent rather than sticking around as a Democrat while he's urging everyone else to stick around as a Democrat. I understand you are operating under different and difficult circumstances that make things that seem hypocritical instead, at some different level, make a great deal of sense. If I can grant you that, I would ask that someone grant also that you can find yourself in similar circumstances and faced with the choice of possibly unilaterally disarming in the face of the greatest challenge over big money in politics we're likely to see in our lifetimes, and perhaps the last best chance of doing something permanent about it, but we're going to go into it hamstrung and handicapped, in the hopes that the purity of our motives will overcome the willfulness of the Supreme Court and those on the other side who also happen to have unlimited funding in their battle. That's going to be a difficult enough fight. So is it possible in my mind to think someone will pour all the resources they can into something like that, and then and do it honestly and forthrightly and with clear intent, even though it means acknowledging afterwards the hypocrisy of how they got there? I can believe that such things would happen. Do I necessarily believe that, Hillary Clinton is the one and only person who could do that? Of course not. Am I positive that that's exactly what's going on? No. I'm taking a risk. But a lot of people who were dissatisfied yesterday and are dissatisfied again this morning with Bernie Sanders took a risk too, and then guess what? They found out that they had a policy departure from Sanders, and they were happily willing to grant themselves the right to march in a different direction and walk away and come to disagreement with the man himself. I get the same latitude. Everyone does. Anyway, so yeah, I see the inherent contradiction, and I move forward anyway and hope for the best. But like I said, one of the very important roles of the presidency is party building, fundraising, etc. And I thought that as between the two, it was less likely that Bernie Sanders would be willing to do the work that was necessary to raise the kind of money and put up the kind of fight from the top of the ticket all the way down that would be necessary. And I thought it much more likely that Hillary Clinton would understand and be willing to embrace that role, even if it wasn't something that she personally relished. And that's what I really thought was likely to happen. Now, since then, of course, part of what came out in the DNC hacking and eventually needs to be dealt with is evidence that tends to show that what was going on with regard to the Hillary Victory Fund wasn't what it was portrayed to be in the press, right? And that, in fact, the accusations made by Bernie Sanders and many Bernie Sanders supporters proved to be correct. That, in fact, it seems considerably less than was portrayed, considerably less than 1% even of the money that was raised by the Hillary Victory Fund went down ballot, I guess. I mean, down to the state parties, which that was the design of the thing. That's not exactly the same thing as down ballot, but it's a close proxy. State parties were supposed to be able to count on some infusion of cash, and they're just really basically not getting it based on what's happened so far with the Hillary Victory Fund. So that ought to be acknowledged. It's not the end of the line for it. And now, of course, that may yet happen. And of course, now if it does happen, they'll say, well, it only happened because we caught you. Okay, maybe, I don't know. Of course, that may have been the plan all along, but then you would hope you would have seen that reflected in the emails, and you don't. There's no objective evidence for that. What there is objective evidence for, yeah, the states aren't getting what we said they were getting, and we haven't been truthful about it. That is bad. I do not like it. But when I ask the question of, do I think Hillary Clinton will fulfill that role post-election? Will she be going to state Democratic dinners, and will people who are her proxies have considerably more clout if they attend on her behalf because she's now president and raise that money in those states later on? Yes, I do. Did I think Bernie Sanders was going to do that? No, I didn't. It may be that he might have been forced into it by circumstances under which many current Bernie Sanders supporters, some of whom were walkouts yesterday, some of whom were not, would say, hypocrisy. And I would say, give him a break. Of course it's hypocrisy. To you, one way of looking at it is hypocrisy. Another way is necessary evil. Remember when we were all voting for the lesser of two evils? It's not perfect. Terrible situations going on here, but commitments were made to people, and we honor commitments, even if sometimes that makes us look less than perfect. We take that hit for the team. I don't believe that he would take as many hits for the team as she would, because he's not on the team. He's not. Maybe he would be if he weren't already elected to the Senate as an independent, but we'll never know until next time, I guess. And there may never be a next time, so, it is possible. We will never know. I really just, when it comes to team building, party building, and yes, doing the hard work of shilling for sometimes candidates that really, truly suck, but would occupy seats on the first day and help us organize the Senate or House along the lines that we could later use to great benefit. Yeah, she'll do it. He won't. I need that out of a candidate. That's, a less than, rhetorically beautiful and politically pure motive. But it is one of the chief jobs of, chief parts of the job description. It's in there. It's got to happen. Somebody's got to do it. It falls to the president. And, a nice speech isn't the same thing as full coffers. We got to have that. It sucks, but that's the reality. And that's what he's telling you right now. Not that, it's for the same reason, but a lot of things that suck, you got to do anyway. So some people, are willing to hear it and act, and some people are not. What I really wanted to get around to, I thought there was another interesting lesson from yesterday's proceedings. The part that was not verified. Remember when I started talking about that? The DNC hack thing, the emails that appear to indicate that the Victory Fund wasn't what it was supposed to be. That all appears to be that sounds pretty verified to me at this point. Okay. The part that's not, what Jordan Chariton was reporting. He tweeted yesterday, and he's tweeted a couple of times since, and the number has changed here and again. But the one that caught my eye, breaking, this was yesterday evening. No, this was actually Monday evening. Breaking, 600 of Bernie Sanders' super volunteers chosen as best volunteers around the U.S., right? Denied credentials to get on the floor at the DNC in Philadelphia. He's the only one I've seen discussing it to date. And it sounded like, wow, that's a situation that really sucks. You got super volunteers. Somebody somewhere along the line, apparently there were some negotiations. I'd really like to be able to reward my super volunteers with floor passes so they can experience the convention at some point. And I guess apparently at some point the DNC / Hillary Clinton people agreed to that. And it's a nice thing to do, and I can see why you would agree to it. Yes, I mean, here are super volunteers for a Democratic, ostensibly, candidate for president. I want to keep them engaged, and a great way to do it is to have them involved at the convention. I've said it, a couple hundred times on the air here. The conventions, aside from their nominating functions, and I did have somebody ask again, in terms of reforms, why do we even do things this way? Why even have delegates and conventions and everything? Why not simply take the popular vote in each state and award the delegates that way? And why not simply do it mathematically instead of worrying about rounding up? Send the fractions. Do it digitally. You can send 35.5 delegates digitally to a centralized delegation voting bank and come up with a nomination without having to worry about rounding off because you can't split delegates in half. It can be done, right? Why have the convention at all? And part of the reason is going there and being a part of it is very different from watching it on television, but even watching it on television, the speeches, the productions, the narrative they get to put together is extraordinarily valuable and motivates people to do things that they sometimes thought they weren't willing to do before, like vote for Hillary Clinton. Lots of people knew they were eventually going to have to put this loyalty, this preference for Bernie Sanders aside and vote for Hillary Clinton, but it really comes home when it's presented in this fashion. The conventions are still an extraordinarily valuable tool for motivation for the troops. So it makes a great deal of sense to say, okay, you're in, but you were in for Bernie Sanders. Okay, we're not nominating him at this convention, but we know what it's like. We know what the excitement of being on hand is about. We know, and really, I mean, some of this is even artificial. You restrict access to the floor for a number of reasons, but part of the reason is to put a premium on being there, and so it seems like an extraordinarily valuable reward to be granted a pass for the day, and they keep it that way for good reason, and not just the fact that, well, okay, the fire marshal also says there can only be X number of people there, and we can't have this. You can't just have people wandering in from off the street. But really, keeping it at a premium means that there's thousands and thousands and thousands of rewards, small rewards that you can dole out one at a time to all the people who need that kind of reward, who deserve that kind of reward, like the 600 super volunteers from around the country. Now, Jordan's tweeting bumped that number up to 800 or so by the end of the night, but that's, beside the point. The point here was, what happened? Why did the DNC, why did Hillary Clinton all of a sudden decide to tell these, is this just another giant FU to Bernie Sanders? Stick it in your eye, Bernie Sanders. Make your volunteers, fly all the way here to Philadelphia at whose expense? I have no idea. And then tell them, no, you can't get on the floor. You can't, you're just not allowed. Well, that's crushing. And it's terrible for engagement. And, of course, the Hillary Clinton people do understand that. This is bad for engagement of these volunteers. It's going to come off making them look like they had it right the whole time, and the little bit of trust that they were willing briefly to put in the Democratic National Committee and the convention process, and Hillary Clinton personally, is being rewarded with another giant slap in the face, and I'm never coming back. Yeah, because that's a pretty big risk that they're actually taking. So why would they take this risk? And I bring it back to yesterday's discussion of the booing going on the floor. It sucked. It was stupid. It wasn't really that many people. No telling whether on television it really would have come through, except for the fact that commentators were trying to take note of it because they heard something and they were, they're doing their job trying to describe what's happening on the floor. People were tweeting about it. Social media certainly made more of it than even traditional electronic media would have been able to make of it if it were left up to them. But okay, it exploded into a bigger issue than it might ever otherwise have because of social media. And so, my question to everybody who then began saying, how dare they? How could they possibly do? They promised. This is another screw you to Bernie Sanders and his supporters. Put yourself in the position of the lower level, probably, functionary, the campaign operative at the DNC and sometimes it's the same thing at this point, the Hillary Clinton campaign. Suppose it's up to you. It's your call on, I have this box of passes that I'm supposed to give out to these 600 super volunteers. We promised. And you know how you want to be about promises. You don't want to be seen as reneging on promises, right? So, okay, fine. So you don't want to do that, and you try to avoid it. But now you're faced with this. Reports reach you that there's this crazy booing situation going on the floor. And it's kind of becoming annoying. And it's kind of distracting the speakers. And it's kind of coming through on television. And it's kind of being blown up into a big thing on social media. What do you do if your name is the answer to the question that will inevitably come should you give out those passes and something goes badly? And the question is asked, who is the goddamn moron who approved 600 volunteers, super volunteers, dedicated to Bernie Sanders, and infusing them into this situation on the floor where there's already too much nonsense going on? They just quadrupled the booing, the volume of now it's coming through on television. Everyone can hear it. And someone asks, who's the idiot that said yes to that? And imagine that's the answer is your name. So the call is up to you. Do you release those passes or do you not? Well, on the one hand, we promised, and it's my responsibility to help Hillary Clinton live up to her reputation as a promise keeper, whether she has it or not. I need to help her keep her promises. So that what? So that these 600 Bernie Sanders voters feel good about her, which is not nothing, particularly if they're super volunteers. They may be great ambassadors in their neighborhoods for Hillary. It's not something to sneeze at. But on the other hand, especially if you've come from the Hillary Clinton camp and or the DNC camp, you've both been equally under attack by the Bernie Sanders camp from time to time, and certainly probably among the ranks of other super volunteers or less super volunteers than you, but you're the leader of all this. And, it now comes to pass, for instance, new angle has been introduced here, right? When we issued these passes, or we promised these passes, did we know that on day one of the convention, the DNC emails would leak? Now that's bad, and it's rotten to have to lean on that. Like, this was your wrongdoing. You can't use that as a reason to deprive the Sanders super volunteers of the passes that you promised them just because, well, I didn't know we were going to get caught. It's not a good, that's true. That's not a good excuse. But that's not what's going through your mind if you're the person who is the answer to the question of what idiot let this happen, right? So chances are, I'm telling you, if I'm that person right then and there, I'm saying, I don't think so. And I am also thinking this at this point. I don't know how to translate this message. I don't know how to get it to those people. I don't think they'll care, even if I give it to them directly, because I am who I am. They just will discount it. But here's something to think about. a lesson for politics in general, for coalition politics, for protest politics, for all politics. The fallout of politics is not as particularly abrasive politics as protest politics needs to be. That is the role of protest politics, and protest politics are real politics. They don't always fall on your own head. So here's what I'm saying. The booing that was going on, I understand it. I can't gag you. I know that it felt like your only alternative, and really, when all is said and done, how bad is it anyway? They're going to overcome it. It's not that awful. Just let the people vent, right? And I said that yesterday too. Let them vent. Parents know eventually they'll run out of steam. And even if they don't, you got to let them vent anyway. What are you going to do? Are you literally going to drag them off the floor? That's worse, right? But real things are happening. That was the intent of your protest, right? Booing, your intent was to be heard. Well, guess what? It's working. So no surprise there. You can't be shocked that people are hearing you and reacting. Some people are mad at you. Some people are going to try to punish you. But what if they don't punish you? What if they punish 600 super volunteers? What if, as it turned out to be the case, the California delegation, which apparently had a lot of the rabble-rousing, to use that as a loaded term, I know, but it had a lot of the booers in it. They had a good spot, and they were hardcore. I mean, there were certainly plenty among other delegations as well. They're booing, right? So now we get a sense of what's happening on the floor. They're holding back these passes for these 600. Love to be able to get the message to people in a way that they could really absorb, because I really think that they would like to think about this and deserve the chance to think about it. And I hope that they do, because it's a great lesson. What if you indulging your insistence that you be heard in protest, and it's a legitimate thing to want, but what if your insistence on being heard in protest cost super volunteers their opportunity to get on the floor? Well, it's not on me. The DNC could have let them in. So the DNC made the decision. Hillary Clinton made the decision not to honor her promise. They probably wouldn't have booed. They probably, remember, you're the ones that keep saying 90% of us are going to vote for Hillary Clinton anyway. So, but, well, yeah, maybe. But like, where do you think that the Bernie Sanders super volunteers are going to gravitate? Some of them are going to gravitate to the booers as well, and some of them might join them, and then somebody is going to have to answer for letting more booers on the floor. I just think it would be valuable to approach some of these people, though I am sure that they would reject the message. It's a valid one nonetheless, and they really need to be told, and it might be justifiable for them to say, I would do it the same way anyway. But the reality is that some of these super volunteers who put their all into the Bernie Sanders campaign, and then, I don't know, maybe even paid their own way to Philadelphia, only to be denied their credentials, that's not necessarily just on the DNC, just on Hillary Clinton. That's on you. That would not have happened but for what we saw you doing at the convention, and we didn't want to contribute to. It's not, it's not mass punishment. It's sensible management of the floor at this point. We can't responsibly add to the booing that's going on, and there's really no reason to expect us to be complicit in doing so, even though it means we reneged on a promise to some campaign volunteers. One, they weren't our campaign volunteers. Two, I don't know what they're going to do with these passes. We're going to let them spit in our eye with the passes? I don't think so. Certainly not the decision that's going to be made by the kind of person in charge of, the actual physical possession of these passes. It's not going to happen. Might be ordered from above, but it won't happen at that level. So I think it would be important to tell people, because I'll tell you how this kind of demonstrates how easy it is in any kind of politics, but in particular in purity politics, to accidentally find yourself slipping into a role that you are positive you would never be in, because you're there protesting its very existence right now. What am I talking about? Well, for lack of a better term, where do we draw the line as between, let's say, the grassroots and the elite when you're talking about a group of people who, all likely were grassroots at some point and still consider themselves to be grassroots, but there's a very real dividing line between them. Some of them are elected delegates to the Democratic National Convention, and others, at best, are, and it's a great thing, but officially speaking, at best, the thing we can say about them is they're super volunteers, and they're going to get the reward of a little bit of time borrowing somebody else's credentials to get on the floor. What has happened here is the elite from among that group, the elected delegates, who, certainly by virtue of their hard work and leadership rose to this level of the elite. And it's unfair to simply label us as elite. It's not like we were born to this role. Yes, I know it's true. But it's actually true of very many of the people in the Hillary Clinton camp, too, who you happily labeled elite all along. It's now happened to you. You're the elite in this group. And you looked pretty comfy in your seats on the floor, enjoying access, booing, or in some cases, as when Michelle Obama was on the stage, as there's now photo documentary evidence, just sitting on your hands, which you're entitled to do. That's, rude but okay. What can I do? I can't make you be enthusiastic about things. That's true. We asked for quiet and we got it. So fine. That's compliance. But, the fact is you were in there enjoying the fruits of your elite position. Now, you earned it, but that's what you were doing. You were enjoying the fruits of your position as an elite among the Bernie Sanders supporters. The grassroots folks, the grass tops, really, of those folks, were waiting outside for their chance. What they really wanted was passes to get on the floor, to be there for Bernie Sanders' speech. That's what they wanted. Or to be there on the day that the speech was being made. They wanted to sense the excitement. That's all they were looking forward to. And they can't have it because you were pretty sure that the smarter thing to do was to let everybody know that you were booing people who were speaking about civil rights because you don't like the TPP. I get it. It's your only forum. You don't want to pass up on your one and only chance either. You worked hard to get there. But other people are likely to suffer the fallout from what you're doing. And that's the lesson. Sometimes it's worth doing anyway, sometimes not. I would like you to think about it. If you guys and your protests cost, I know you don't believe it's going to cost Hillary the election. And really, neither do I. Really, very few people do. It's a worry because Trump is such a nut, but okay. That's not going to happen. Well, what you could be doing, and almost certainly did do, was cost super volunteers their chance to, really feel the payoff of their work. But you got the payoff of your work. So that's cool. Sometimes somebody has to get paid off and somebody is not going to get paid off in order for that, that political capital's got to pass to somebody, and maybe it's a zero-sum game, and you took it. I'm sure you feel like you were entitled to it, but a real Bernie Sanders supporter would wonder just a little bit. Just give it some time to think. Was that political capital something I was entitled to 100% of, or should I have shared it? And if the answer is no, I should never, ever have shared it, that's interesting. It didn't take you long to get to that point, and you might even be right. Because believe me, I give plenty of leeway to other people who I support, and they regularly make a practice of absorbing 100% of the capital. That's what politics is about, unfortunately, at its rawest. I mean, how many times do you think a Clinton or any other politician, including Bernie Sanders, I'm sure, I promise you, there's somebody somewhere in Vermont that says regularly to their peers, that thing that everybody credits Bernie Sanders for, that was my idea. I was working for him at the time, and then he took all the credit for it, and now here he is running for president, and and I'm out of the party, or I lost my position, or he fired me, or whatever. There's definitely people out there, whether they're right or wrong, who believe that. And it's just, That's just the reality of politics. I can't fix that. I can't teach you how to avoid that. I can't eliminate it from politics. Neither can you. It's just when there's rounding error involved, when there's one pass and two people that have a claim to it, one set of credentials, two people have a claim to it, and one person is in possession of it, and the other person is not in possession of it, but was promised that they would be given temporary possession of it, and you opt to keep it, or you opt to do something that makes it impossible for the people who control its transfer to approve that transfer, you've appropriated political payoff to yourself that never belonged to you. It just didn't feel like that. You didn't know about that other thing. You may never have been made aware of it. Now you're aware. It's something to think about. But also the countervailing power here is, well, accumulating political power to myself, accumulating political capital to myself, working for it, holding on to it when I get it, especially when I don't see any legitimate other claimant in front of me. If someone was in front of me making a legitimate claim on it, I might have felt differently about it, but it never occurred to me and it was never presented to me. It's not your fault. I understand that. I forgive you for that. Just think, you're always, if you're going to stay engaged in politics, and I don't know that you will, but if you are going to stay engaged in politics, eventually you're going to have yourself presented with that problem. I have accumulated political capital to myself. The right thing to do in a vacuum is to share it with these other claimants. But I also have more work to do here. Now, I have risen to the position of elected delegate to the Democratic National Convention. I am on my way to rising to the position of state Democratic Party committee person, and maybe one day to chair, and maybe one day to one of those positions at the DNC that used to be superdelegates, whatever, or running for Congress or anything like that. And I could do so much good, so many people I could help, if I just hold on to this political capital and utilize it wisely. I don't know if booing is utilizing it wisely, but okay, at the moment you thought so. Whatever. People make bad decisions, right? The point is, you've accumulated this capital, and the question always is, do I share it or do I use it to accumulate more and then distribute the greater benefits later on of that? That's the nature of politics. It's the nature of any kind of investment at all. But, somewhere along the line, people who are truly altruistic in nature through and through have to make the decision. Do I distribute the benefits now, or do I accumulate them, making sure that they inure to my benefit personally, or in the form of my campaign, if you prefer? Move on, move ahead, capture that new office, accumulate the power that goes with that, and then distribute those benefits. And then all the way up the ladder. And we know how politics works in terms of elective office, right? Even for Bernie Sanders, right? Run for mayor, run for Congress, run for Senate, run for president. At any one of those stops along the way, you could say, now is the time for me to distribute my political capital. All of it. Or, more likely, you make the calculation, some of this political capital will be held in reserve for the opportunity to move up and accumulate yet more that I can distribute later, and some will be distributed now. But that's the balance. And even at the lowly level of one time being elected to the to delegate to the Democratic National Convention, even then you can have that choice put to you. Not ordinarily, but in this case, yes. That's an awful long time to spend on one, particularly as it has not yet been confirmed anywhere else. I'm just saying, though, it certainly sets up a great hypothetical, if nothing else. Deep thoughts about the nature of politics at the very, very lowest grassroots level, I think. Although there are grassroots levels quite lower than that. I mean, how many volunteers who thought they were really, really super didn't get chosen as super volunteers and sent? I don't know. The line had to be drawn somewhere, right? But I'm sure somebody feels excluded. Do they feel like Bernie Sanders is at fault? No, Probably not. Do they feel like Hillary Clinton is at fault? How dare she only allow 600 of us? If it had been 650, I would have been able to go. I don't know. But anyway, the point is that these exercises are something that you engage in politics, no matter where you enter politics, and you ought to keep it in mind. It's okay to decide to keep the benefits for yourself. It's especially excusable if you're not really made aware of the actual choice before you. And then, of course, it's also okay for you to become aware of it and still say, I still think the best use of this capital is expressing our discontent in a way that the world will see. But consider that it might not be. That is a possibility. Anyway, nearing the end of the show, I didn't really know that I was going to get that deep into it, but I felt that story rather deeply for some reason, and I thought it was a great illustration of the political choice making that politicians make writ large, or rather, when politicians make them, when high elected officials make them, it is writ large. And on a very small scale, you can understand perhaps that the same decisions are being made by everybody in politics. And then if you can get yourself comfortable with that and get your head wrapped around it, you can begin to extrapolate from that and understand how you do things like, damn, this is really not a policy decision in keeping with where I want to be, ideally. But if I don't do this, I'm going to fail in my next attempt to accumulate even more political capital, at which point I believe I can put things right. And also, I guess, countervailing, I will say, history is rife with examples of people promising that to themselves, making that deal with themselves, and then not necessarily delivering fully. I don't know how this one came out, but I brought to mind the example of when Bob Menendez was first running for Senate. And this one I just happened to know in the back of my head. So, there's 100 others doing the same thing. But there was a point at which he was asked as a member of the House to vote on, what was it, like the Military Commissions Act, right? Remember way back when they were basically looking to retroactively legally justify military commission trials for Guantanamo detainees. And it was pretty obvious by the time the vote came around that this was conservative garbage, that this is something that Democrats properly ought not to have any truck with whatsoever. But strategically, it was put to him, you're standing for election to the Senate, a much bigger electorate now, the entirety of the state of New Jersey. There are plenty of swing voters in that pool and conservatives who will otherwise attack you unless you... Blah, blah. So, all the same stupid strategic considerations you're supposed to have to consider every time you try and take a step up or even just stand for re-election. Whether or not there really are swing voters, we don't know. Whether or not there really are conservatives who can be convinced not to attack you because you didn't step in the bear trap, doesn't matter. They'll attack you for something else. Or for that matter, they'll just say you stepped in the bear trap anyway, even if you didn't, right? But he was actually fairly open with the notion of, well, I did this, because I'm running for Senate, but I feel terrible about it. And I actually dedicate myself to undoing the damage as a member of the Senate. I'll have much more clout there. And it's true, you will have that much more clout there, but on the other hand, you'll have that many more demands on your time as well, and, of course, a different set of circumstances, and 99 other senators who don't really care that you promised to redeem yourself. You really would have to put all your time into redeeming yourself, and no time left to put into those projects for which you compromised yourself in the first place, swearing that you would be able to deliver those things if you could only just make it to the Senate. It's not just Bob Menendez, of course. It's everybody who's in the Senate has done this with something. It's everybody who's in the House who did it when they compromised themselves in the state legislatures. It's everybody in the state legislature who compromised themselves on city council. And it's every delegate that compromised themselves in deciding to indulge themselves in something, frankly, not all that productive in my view, but in your view, whatever. You indulge yourself in it, and super volunteer over here is the one who suffers. But who cares? I'm moving on up. But I believe that there are people who would care. So I spend an awful lot of time on it, and maybe you know one of them. And they'll vehemently deny that that was the case. And nobody told me, and that's probably not even true. And they were going to deny them no matter what. All of which may be true, all of which may just be a defense mechanism. You will never know. It's just a consideration. Just thought I'd put it out there. Anyway, we'll have plenty more to consider, of course, after tonight. And then, of course, Thursday night is the big conclusion of the convention. We'll have all of those speeches to evaluate. We'll have plenty of heavy hitters tonight. Biden will speak. President Obama will speak. This is a very interesting thing. Somebody pointing out that it's been many, many years since there was the opportunity for a handoff speech by a sitting president. We'll be very interested, all of us, I think, in finding out who addresses which topics and how tonight. We'll be back tomorrow, of course, to continue with our analysis, or perhaps diverting into minutia like we did today. But I thought interesting and important minutia. I hope the message gets to somebody, and I hope it promotes some interesting and introspective thought about the very nature of their involvement in politics. And I don't know, maybe someday somebody really, truly awesome and altruistic will sacrifice part of their political capital to help you because they heard it here one day on the show. That's an amazing and ridiculous reach. Anyway, what about the rest of the day, the rest of the programming day here today? We can only guess at what we'll be talking about tomorrow, although we have a pretty good idea, and probably we'll end up with the same morning post as we did today. Scratch out first day and add in second. It's all, at some level, it seems like it's all the same, don't you think? Anyway, what comes after this amazing feat of solo discussion of the most minute details of the Democratic National Convention and political science in general that I put on today? Some news, probably, and the actual coverage of stories out there instead of my own musings. Wednesday show is full of Whoa Wednesday, as a matter of fact, on the after show, coming up immediately after this program. Just 21 years ago, Walmart banned "Someday a Woman Will Be President" t-shirts for offending family values. Can you imagine? That's a hell of a landmark. What a great find, Justice. All right. An Oregon pastor won an AR-15 and will destroy it so that it won't kill anyone in a school. Did see somebody tweet me that one today. Great find also. And your gold jewelry is killing wildlife, destroying forests, and accelerating climate change. I know that you might make a decision differently. If it were put to you, if the information were laid out in front of you, you might make your decisions differently. That's what we're doing here. It's politics on every level. Thanks, Justice and Wink, for bringing us those two things for the last half. The host of the Katie Speak Show on Netroots Radio, Katie Klavisic, for reports on women's health and the feminist
Daily
news
Codes
roundup.
Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, I gave you some lessons on the nature of politics today. If nothing else, politics left to its own devices tends to run on way too long and become far too self-indulgent, as politicians often do. Anyway, stay tuned for all of that, plus the Connect, Unite, Act Daily Coast Community Calendar, and more on the After Show with Lincoln Justice. I will indulge myself no further.